First of all, good morning. UN Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed. Madam Deputy Secretary General, thank you so much for taking time out to be with us this morning, and welcome to Manila.
Thank you. I'm really pleased to be here, and thank you for having me.
We'd like to begin our discussion by talking about Sustainable Development Goals because, the Philippines is actually, like all the other UN countries, one of those that's really committed to achieving Sustainable Development Goals. But based on the latest numbers and latest overall performance of all UN member states, the Philippines is actually at number 92 out of 167 countries, and we have a score of 67.47. So this is slightly improved from our score in 2022, but it still makes us one of the countries more behind in the ASEAN region. We have only achieved SDG 12. At this rate, do you think the Philippines can achieve a significant number of SDG targets by 2030, which is the deadline set by the UN?
Well, first let's put it in context. The world is not doing well. It's not just the Philippines. We have a terrible score of 17% of the SDGs globally. People are struggling. They were struggling before COVID. They were struggling even more because trying to recover your economies after COVID was pretty serious. The climate crisis has been pretty bad. The war in Ukraine has also affected a lot of what has happened to supply chains and weakened economies. So there have been a lot of exacerbating factors as to why countries are not doing as well. Having said that, there's a whole lot that we can do to accelerate to get to 2030. And maybe many of us may not reach that, but right now we believe there's a lot of things that we can do. And that's why we have the Summit of the Future and the Pact, which consolidated a commitment to say that the SDGs were number one for us to get to by 2030. Number two was to look at the peace and security and to make sure that that agenda was a priority. To look at new technologies which could help us to accelerate for the SDGs, particularly AI. And last but not least, what has really constrained countries for not achieving the SDGs has been the international finance architecture that must be redesigned, look at debt, look at access to markets for long-term concessional funding. So when I look at all these goals, I see the potential for the Philippines to do much better. But it needs also the support of the international community.
Based on the different bilateral talks or meetings that you've had since you arrived, are you optimistic that the Philippines will reach these goals by 2030?
I'm very optimistic that you will go far. There are a number of challenges that you have ahead. Reforms have to be owned and they have to be consolidated upon. This is a complex country of archipelagos where you have different forms of governance and autonomous regions. All of these have to come together for the Philippines to be said to have achieved the SDGs. So in some parts of the Philippines, even within Manila, you may achieve the SDGs, but in other parts you won't, and that will drag the country back as a whole. So it's important that we look at all the communities, at all youths, at all women, and I think then with the support of the international community, the UN, certainly we have worked around a cooperation framework that shows what we will bring to the table. But the private sector have to bring something to the table. Government has to bring something to the table. The international community has to do that. And then I think we'll go far.
Is there any particular area of reform you think that the Philippines has to focus on?
I think they have to focus more on an inclusive economy that produces jobs for people. I think it's very important that the diversification of the economy is important, more focus on food systems, growing your economy that you can pay for the services that people need to see in health, in education, in water and sanitation. These are all really important.
Do you think that at this point 2030 is still a realistic deadline for everybody to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals?
It's an agreed deadline, and so therefore we should do as much as we can do before then. I'm not a believer in not attempting to make the best of the 5 years that we have, because it will involve millions of people's lives that we could make an improvement in, for education, for health, for more peaceful communities, for jobs. These are really important issues. So if we can get hundreds of millions across the line and we still have hundreds of millions behind, we got some. And I think we should do the best to do that, and I think we can. And my couple of days here has shown me the potentials.
Are there consequences for countries that might not make the 2030 deadline?
Absolutely. People will be left behind. Women's rights will be left behind. Gender-based violence will not have been eradicated as we would like it to be. Hunger and poverty, inequalities, the lack of jobs, those are implications, and they can cause a lot of social unrest. Climate, and as you see it now, more intense events that are happening. If we don't deal with mitigation and emissions, adaptation, then of course there will be more suffering every time you have a climate event. So the implications for not getting the agenda done are clear, and that should give us the incentives and the momentum to push to get it done, because we really can't leave anyone behind.
Is there a possibility that the UN might say, oh, you know what, maybe we can extend the deadline beyond 2030?
No, we don't extend deadlines. We get there, we take stock, and then we have another set of goals.
And to see what we can achieve more.
To see what we can achieve more. And things will be different. Remember, with the Pact of the Future, we didn't have technology up front and center in 2015. So the Pact has brought that to the fore. It's become an accelerator, an opportunity for inclusion if we invest in connectivity and we allow for financial services to reach women, e-commerce to be there in the whole value chain of food systems, for instance. So there are lots of potentials from seeing things that were not there in 2015, but now we have put them on the agenda to see.
Speaking of the Pact of the Future, do you believe that the Pact of the Future is different from all the other agreements made in the past that all the countries have agreed upon? How is it different from all those?
I think as a recognition of some things we need to do better, because in 1945 this was not the situation we met. We are 75 years later, and things have changed. In many more countries, their GDP is better. They are independent. Many things have happened over the last decades that have improved the standard of living and the economies. But it is still a very unequal world. And so what the Pact does is to say, on a global agenda, let's get the SDGs done. As a global community, let's look at peace and security, that the Security Council is more representative of its world, and that it can do better than it is doing today. And let's look at prevention, let's look at mediation, where are women in that? We also looked at, as I said, the new technologies and how we can create the guardrails for the potential of new technologies and perhaps leapfrogging in education. And then, of course, the financial system. This is a system designed not for today, and it needs to be more inclusive. It needs to open up the capital markets so that you can invest in development and grow your economy. Your domestic resources that you mobilize from that can then do the very basics for the people of the Philippines and, of course, other countries.
Well, speaking of how very different the situation is now from 1945,
yes.
Well, the UN is actually celebrating its founding anniversary soon, and a lot of people have been saying that maybe there are countries that have been questioning the relevance of the United Nations in this particular era. And we have countries like the UK, Israel, France, and Germany, and even the US saying that their views of the UN are not as favorable as they used to be, although it's different here in the Philippines. But what is your reaction to all these doubts about the relevance of the UN now?
Well, I think the Pact of the Future proved that in very difficult geopolitical tensions, we were able to agree. This was an agreement over 130, 40 countries that came to say the Pact was relevant on these important issues. So multilateralism still works and is still very important to our global family, being able to have a voice for their concerns, for the opportunities, for the challenges, a space where there is a light on all issues. And if it wasn't there, many things wouldn't be known. And in darkness, horrible things happen. Today, we're still struggling to make the reality, which is not so good in many areas. The many conflicts that we have in Sudan, in Myanmar, in Gaza, in the Ukraine. All these shouldn't be happening today, but they are, and we have got mechanisms that try each day to get a ceasefire, to get to a place of peace, and it does take time. But imagine if it wasn't there, then you would not know what is happening. You would not have the opportunity to call people together, to try to find those mediation spaces for communication, for using the good offices of the SG to bring people together for peace. So I think, we're having a tough time. We are not meeting the expectations of the people of the world in solving these conflicts today. But without us having that space to continue to try to do that, it would be much worse.
Are there talks about how the UN could perhaps get its members to truly uphold agreements and other international laws. Like, for example, recently, Secretary General Antonio Guterres told Russian President Vladimir Putin that the invasion of Ukraine violated the UN Charter and international law. And another issue that hits closer to home is the South China Sea and the dispute in the South China Sea. And there was already a ruling based on UNCLOS that it is a shared territory and there's a clear division of territories. So what does the UN plan to do to get its members to really follow the rules or uphold its rulings?
Well, the mechanisms that we have, although they may not be doing what they should be doing today, are still there for us to use them. The toolbox that we have for mediation, the toolbox for convening and allowing us to come into those spaces to try to find the solutions through dialogue, peaceful means, reduce the tensions, not go over, come back again to the table. I think in many cases we probably need to have more women around the table. We will probably have quicker solutions to a lot of what we have. But as the Secretary General has said, he's calling for more dialogue. So yes, he's holding up the light where the rule of law has been crossed, and we have to come back. But I think what is more important in the conflicts that we see, the ceasefire, we have to stop the number of lives that have been taken, particularly women and children, and open up that space again for dialogue, to use, as I said, the instruments that we have. It is not just in Ukraine, it is not just in the South China Sea. These are all areas that every day there are activities going on to try to find solutions. But it is in many other parts of the country too, of which there's a lot of concern. And this is why the imperative for the SDGs, because a lot of these situations are created when we don't have sufficient development, when we don't have sufficient engagement of young people, of people better educated to get into positions of leadership that will speak to peace and will speak to solidarity and the unity of the world.
Another thing that I wanted to ask about was the Loss and Damage Fund, because this is something that the United Nations has agreed upon that is needed, still in relation to the SDGs. So the Philippines has been selected as a host country of the Loss and Damage Fund, and estimates show that developing countries need at least $400 billion each, and that's per year, to address loss and damages from climate change alone. But as of September 2024, only $702 million has been pledged to the fund by different countries. So what is the UN doing to make sure that developed countries take perhaps more responsibility in contributing to the fund, and that countries like ours, like the Philippines, extremely vulnerable to climate change, will still benefit from this?
Well, first let's congratulate the world that they came together in the shortest possible time in Sharm el-Sheikh and got the Loss and Damage Fund in and stood up. That was not a given. However, funding it, like everything else today, is challenged with public resources, private resources, all are challenged. What the UN is doing is that we will have COP29 in Baku in Azerbaijan in a few weeks' time. This is a finance COP, and it will be talking about what we do with a recommitment to a quantitative goal that will allow us to execute Article 9 of the Paris Agreement that brings public funding to climate action. And the Loss and Damage Fund is very much a part of that. There will be additional funding that is required. Actually, for the SDGs, we're between $4.5 trillion a year that is needed. It is billions to trillions. And for the climate agenda, we're looking at this $1.4 trillion. $1 trillion of that is probably going to come from the private sector, but at least $400 billion, and of which we hope to see the Loss and Damage Fund gain from it. So a lot of pressure for that to happen. As you said, host country, we have a fund, we have the mechanisms to allow that fund to work through the World Bank. So we have made some steps. Now we just need to fuel it to put the resources in it that we need.
All right. You mentioned the importance of the private sector coming in.
Yes.
Do you see the higher involvement from the private sector in recent years?
Yes, absolutely. We've seen through the UN Global Compact much more greening of their own processes. We've seen many more principles that on accountability, on governance, be, I think, integrated in what they do, particularly in industries. But again, we have another opportunity that says the nationally determined contributions, the climate plans that have to be ready by COP30 in Brazil need to be economy-wide. Now that will tackle every single industry. and that will bring the private sector in to really show and demonstrate how they're going to do that. I'll have the privilege of meeting many of your private sector CEOs in the coming day, and I hope that we will be able to see how it is that they will be contributing to changing their business systems, to changing their, the opportunities for greener jobs, and to be a part of lifting the SDGs to success in 2030.
Recently, we were hit by Typhoon Christine, and the private sector came in with a lot of help. I wanted to ask also what the UN is doing to address humanitarian issues, especially amongst affected populations. What can be done, especially like let's say in the Middle East, so many humanitarian cases affecting millions. What is the UN doing to address all these? Are there particular concrete efforts to address these?
Well, I think, day by day you'll hear the Secretary General call for humanitarian law to be respected. In many cases this is not respected, and it must be. We must have access, everyone must have, we must be able to save every life. In fact, today we talk about the livelihoods as well. So humanitarian law is important. It is important to fund the humanitarian space. It saves lives. Today we're really not funding the commitments that have been made, or the needs in many of the humanitarian crises. So we're also trying to encourage governments to do that. There are other issues that we take up because we find in many countries the internally displaced persons are very high, mostly from climate events, but also from conflict. And that is something that we are putting more effort behind, where we call that durable solutions internally, to help better efficiencies in governments to respond to a humanitarian crisis. So both on the global and the local side, bringing together the resources needed. But we have to speak to both our traditional donors and broadening the base for others to come on board to support this area that is critically important, but is not getting the kind of funding that is needed to save lives.
All right. Well, Madam Deputy Secretary General, we know that you're also here in Manila for the conference on women, peace, and security. How do you see the conference influencing policy and action in conflict-affected regions?
Well, first, we're very thankful for the Philippines hosting it. It's coming off the back of the Security Council meeting on women, peace, and security that I attended. And as the SG has said, 25 years later, we're not doing well. The number of conflicts are increasing, the burden on women who are affected by conflict in a space where the environment does not even allow for you to deliver a baby safely, but worse still, the kind of atrocities that are committed on women through gender-based violence are huge. The lack of access to aid is not there either. So this is coming at an opportune moment when we're saying we need more women at the table, mediation, in prevention, in the day after. And without us at the table, we will not have durable solutions or sustainable peace. And many of these issues have been brought up because, of course, we've got the conflicts that we can point to where we are not visible, where the increase of the number of women at the table is less than 20%. This is not good enough 25 years later. So what more can we do? We also have a youth, peace and security agenda, and they need to come together. So young people, women at the table, showing their leadership. The Philippines has done that. We've seen a woman who's been in charge of the peace process here in the Philippines, and I think that that's very encouraging. So I think that by example, to see where the gaps are and try to address them is why we're here, to put a lot more visibility on it and show how it can be done. And if there were to be any more peace tables that are opened and there are no women there, I would say barricade the doors until they're allowed in. No peace talks unless there are women in it. It's not for the sake of women. It's what we bring to the table of inclusivity, of bearing the burden of many of these conflicts, and so we know what it is, the dividends of peace, and that should be, it should be a no-brainer that we're at the table. But look, this is political. This is still the battle that we have to achieve these successes.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Madam Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me.